Hello everybody, this is Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we're back with another of our 5-Minute Histories videos. And today I'm on 34th Street in Hampden, the place of the over-the-top Christmas lights, holiday lights. But I'm not going to talk about the lights today. I'm here because it is a little before New Year's Eve, and I bet many of us on New Year's Eve are going to watch a ball drop, maybe on TV of Times Square, maybe in person in Times Square, and maybe, just maybe, here on 34th Street watching a disco ball drop from a light pole, and then a grown man running through the streets in an oversized diaper dressed as Baby New Year's. All right, before we start to try to unpack that, let me say a quick word of thanks as we head into the end of the year for everybody who has donated to Baltimore Heritage. Your gift of $10 or $50 or $100 is an enormous help. Over 75% of our operating funds come from private donations, so thank you, and thank you to everybody who's considering a last-minute donation. All right, back to ball dropping. Before we get to Hampden, we wondered, how did we start associating lowering an orb to celebrate the beginning of the new year? And for that, we have to turn to ancient times. The ancient Greeks, for example, in their agora, their public squares, would lower a small ball at a designated hour of the day to help people keep track of the time of day. In modern times, sailors picked up on this idea, particularly a gentleman named Robert Woolshope, who was a captain in the British Royal Navy. He is the person who is credited with inventing the modern ball drop, that's what they call it. With the help of the Greenwich Observatory, every day at 1 o'clock, they would drop a ball, and the ship's captains, the ships bobbing up and down on the Thames, would be able to set their nautical clocks to the exact time based on this ball drop off the Greenwich Observatory. Woolshope was apparently a magnanimous guy, and when visiting dignitaries came, he showed them the technique. And apparently somebody from the U.S. picked up on it, and by 1845, we were dropping a ball from the Naval Observatory in Washington, but not at 1, at noon, which I think is a more sensible hour to do it. So now we have a connection between ball dropping and time, but how do we get to New Year's Eve? For that, we need to go to New York City, and the Naval Observatory was not the only building dropping balls. Another building was one called the Western Union Telegraph Building in New York, and they would drop a ball to showcase the new telegraph technology. And the way it showcased it was that the trigger for the ball drop was not somebody inside the building. It was a telegraph sent from Washington, D.C. And if the lines were clear and all worked well, the telegraph went through, triggered a mechanism, and at noon the ball would drop. So that's how we get to New York. How we get to New Year's Eve is a gentleman named Adolph Oakes. Adolph Oakes was owned the New York Times in the early 1900s, and he had built a fabulous new headquarters building, 1 Times Square, and wanted to show it off. On New Year's Eve, for a few years, he had been setting off fireworks, and that was pretty good. But he looked over at the Western Union Telegraph Building and thought, aha, if I drop a ball in the last seconds before the new year, that would be really fabulous, and a lot of people would come. But he knew for it to be a success, he had to have a fantastic ball to drop. And for that, he turned to a group called Art Craft Strauss. And they designed a 5-foot diameter ball with 100 incandescent light bulbs in it. And it did indeed draw a crowd. Thousands of people came, and then the next year, thousands, and the next year, and the next year. And they've been doing it in Times Square ever since, except for 1942 and 1943, when we were in a blackout order for World War II. Today, the ball is a little different. It's 12 feet in diameter, has 32,000 LED lamps in it, and is covered with Waterford crystal. So pretty spectacular. 1 million people each year cram into Times Square to watch that ball drop, and on top of their heads is thrown 3,000 pounds of confetti from 100 volunteers on the rooftops. All, of course, pretty spectacular. But Times Square didn't have the monopoly on ball dropping, and pretty soon other neighborhoods in New York started dropping balls, and then pretty soon other cities and towns started dropping balls, and today there's a whole array of things you can watch. In Maryland, for example, you can go to Berlin and watch a ball drop on New Year's Eve. In Ocean City, you can go and watch a beach ball get dropped, of course. And being human beings of creativity, we of course started dropping things other than time balls. In Easton, you can watch a red crab drop on New Year's Eve. In Frederick, you can watch a giant key, the birthplace of Francis Scott Key. And in Princess Anne, which I don't totally understand, you can watch a giant stuffed muskrat. named Marshall P. Muskrat get dropped on New Year's Eve. Maryland has a number of drops, but the king of dropping has to be Pennsylvania. We counted no fewer than 60 towns in Pennsylvania that dropped things on New Year's Eve. Some are pretty creative and some are just over the top. York, Pennsylvania, of course, drops a rose, a white rose. Think of the Yorks and the Lancasters in the Battle of the War of the Roses in England. And Lancaster, Pennsylvania, of course, drops a red rose. No rivalry there. A town called Shippensburg drops an anchor. A town called Pottsville, the home of Yuengling beer, the oldest brewery in America, drops, of course, a big bottle of Yuengling. Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, drops a giant wrench. And Kennett Square, the self-proclaimed mushroom capital of the world, of course, drops a giant mushroom. On the more fantastic end, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, you would think would drop a star, but they don't. They drop a giant peep. Currently, the candy maker Peeps is headquartered in Bethlehem. Easton, Pennsylvania is apparently a family-friendly place because they lower a giant crayon at 10 p.m. so that the kids can go to bed in a decent hour. But maybe my favorite is Dillsburg, Pennsylvania, of course lowering dill pickles, not one but two. At 7 p.m. they lower what they call Little Dill at 7 p.m. Pennsylvania time, but midnight Ireland time, and that's where their founders came from. And then at midnight they lower a giant Mr. Pickle to celebrate the new year. All right, wrapping up back to Baltimore and back to here. For generations, Baltimoreans have celebrated New Year's hooping and hollering, mostly from bar stools, from what we can gather. We didn't get our ball drop until the folks here creating the Miracle on 34th Street decided, well, just because Christmas is over, why not stop the over-the-top celebrations? And in one year, they looked at New York and said, well, we don't have one Times Square to drop a ball from, but we do have a light pole, and we don't have a Waterford crystal ball, but we do have a disco ball. And so they began the tradition of dropping a disco ball from a light pole on New Year's Eve, with one of the founders, a gentleman named Bob Hosier, sprinting through the streets in an oversized diaper as Baby New Year's. As one resident is quoted as saying, New York don't have nothing on Hampden. And with that, I'm going to say, Happy New Year, everyone, hun.